Hello, and welcome to Book Circle. I'm Earl Weinberg. This time we will continue our reading of Village Centenary by Miss Reed. Chapter 4. April. Amy's party took place on the second day of the month. After a boisterous morning, which toppled the crocuses and blew the rooks off course, the sun came out, and by the time I set off all was tranquil. The western sky was dappled with little pink clouds as the sun went down, and the air was so clear and still that I could see a range of hills some 20 miles away to the south. Obedient to Amy's request, I had donned a long black skirt bought at Caxley's Most Favored Outfitters, and identical to quite half a dozen I observed on various local friends during the past winter. The blouse that topped it was of black and white silk, which I thought looked rather fetching, but as it had a back zip, I was resigned to undertaking violent contortions to do it up every time I wore it, and was beginning to wonder how long it would be before such exercises were beyond me. As usual, I was the first to arrive. Amy greeted me with the usual affection. "You look splendid, truly elegant. Come and see the table. I'm rather proud of the flowers." She led the way into the dining room, and it certainly was a vision of delight. Daffodils and narcissi scented the room, and in the center of the table was a magnificent arrangement of freesias and miniature daffodils in shades of cream and gold. Amy stood surveying it, a look of supreme satisfaction on her face. "It's perfect," I told her. "And that damask tablecloth was my grandmother's. It's a devil to launder, and so it doesn't get used very often, but those Victorians had some good ideas about dressing a table." Do you remember Mrs. Beeton's illustration for a simple supper party? 3 epergnes of red roses down the center, and smilax trailing everywhere. Our old edition had a picture of a tray for an invalid, recalled Amy. There were 2 silver trumpet-shaped flower vases with carnations, as well as 2 or 3 dishes complete with silver covers, a coffee pot, milk jug, and sugar bowl. I don't think you could lift the thing, let alone stagger upstairs with it. But I must say it looked superb. I pity anyone being taken ill in my house. A plate of toast and a mug of tea would be about my limit. James has occasionally brought me my breakfast in bed when I've been too ill with flu or something equally horrid to get up. He can manage very thick bread and butter, with the crusts rather touchingly cut off, and the marmalade pot, and a cup of tea, with most of it in the saucer by the time he's negotiated the stairs. But I certainly don't get carnations, and to be honest, I don't think I should appreciate them in the state I'm in when I have to stay in bed. "Now tell me who's coming," I said when we returned to the sitting room. "The 2 poets I told you about, and Betty Mason, the pianist. Jean Cole is on tour in Belgium. I managed to get in touch with Major Gunning, thanks to you, and he says she'll be back next week, and you'll find out her plans." "He won't forget," I assured her. "He was the mainstay of dozens of our village committees." "I invited him tonight, but he says he's become rather too old for parties. A shame, really. He sounds a dear." "And James?" "No James, I'm afraid. At a company dinner in South Shields. But I've invited Horace Umbleditch to make it 6. He's giving an organ recital in the church as part of the Caxley Festival, so he'll enjoy meeting some of the others, I hope. And anyway, he's devoted to you." "He's nothing of the sort," I protested. "I hardly know the fellow." "Well, I know better. And he's moved into such a charming house in the school grounds now, and could well do with a wife." "Amy, you are incorrigible. You know I have no wish to marry, nor presumably has Horace Umbleditch, and if he had, I'm sure he could find someone younger and keener than I am. Do leave us happy old spinsters and bachelors in peace." "Hoity-toity," cried Amy, as the front doorbell rang. I watched her as she hurried to answer it, admiring the back view of her elegant cream silk caftan. Had she chosen it for tonight's occasion as the perfect complement to her flower arrangement? Knowing Amy, I guessed that she had. She returned with Betty Mason in tow, a short, rather dumpy person wearing black with a sparkling necklace. She had beautifully waved silver hair and a soft, powdery pink and white complexion which reminded me of marshmallows. During the evening, I was to discover that she was as sweet and gentle as her looks. We had scarcely greeted each other when Amy was called to the door again, and Horace Umbleditch arrived. There was no need for introductions, as Betty and Horace knew each other, and were soon deep in discussion about the best choice of music for a country festival. Then, turning to me, Horace asked if I had heard the good news about his sister Irene. Henry Maughan told me, I said, and then wondered if the good news he spoke of was about the proposed marriage to David Maughan after all. Perhaps it was something quite different. A new post, maybe, or a fantastic win on the pools, always supposing that Irene went in for such things. However, I did not have to endure suspense for long. As Horace said, the wedding was to be early in June at a registry office, and no doubt I should see them before then, as they proposed to stay for a few days with Henry during the Caxley Festival. It is marvelous news, I agreed, glad to be right for once. And where will they live? For the moment in David's flat, but I expect they will move further out sometime. It's not much fun there for Simon in the holidays, and I'm sure Irene will look forward to making a home elsewhere. Away from the haunting horrors which that flat must hold for David, I thought privately, and for young Simon, who had seen his mother at her most terrifying in those surroundings. Amy came in and glanced at the clock, which said 8:15. I do hope the others haven't lost their way. They are coming together. Tim Ferdinand's usually pretty punctual, said Horace. Oh, you know him. I hadn't realized that. Very slightly. He came to the school one evening to read poetry to the boys. They were remarkably well behaved. No one knew quite how to react to the last remark, and Amy said she must go and check that the crab was all right, conjuring up visions of a sickly crustacean with a bottle of medicine alongside. Something smells delicious, commented Betty kindly. I just hope it won't be overdone, said Amy, setting off for the kitchen. It's in a light cheese sauce, and you know how easily that can dry up. Amy is the best cook I know, said Horace with enthusiasm. After school meals, all cabbage and custard, the food here is sheer ambrosia. It's so nice, said Betty, to find people interested in food. I can't bear those who profess to have a mind above it, particularly when you have spent all day and a great deal of money in preparing something you think they will enjoy. The bell rang again, and we heard voices in the hall. I can't think, we heard a despairing voice say, where I went wrong, but we took a shortcut and ended up on the downs. It really is too bad the way some of these roads simply peter out into sheep tracks. 100 apologies, Amy dear. All is forgiven, said Amy, and you really aren't late at all. Come and meet the others. She ushered in a short, tubby man with a florid complexion set off by a neat white mustache. He could have been taken for a retired colonel or a particularly kindly bank manager. Perhaps he was, I thought, and simply wrote his poems in his spare time on the back of Queen's Regulations or the bank's blotting paper. John Chandler, said Amy. He has just published his 3rd book of poems. We all gave cries of admiration and welcomed our fellow guest. And Timothy Ferdinand, you know Horace, I believe, and this is Betty Mason, the pianist, and Miss Reed. We made more polite noises, and I thought how much more like a poet he looked. For one thing, he was painfully thin and pale, as Amy had told me, with a wobbly Adam's apple which showed to advantage as he wore an open-necked shirt above blue jeans carefully fringed at the ankle. I was glad to see he had socks on under the inevitable sandals, and his hands were clean. He looked a pleasant if vague young man, and still seemed to be brooding about the way he became lost on his journey. It happens to all of us, I assured him. It's those crossroads at Springbourne. Someone said once that it seems to be moved overnight. As a matter of fact, some young people did turn the signpost round one night, and confusion was worse confounded. He looked a little happier. You're quite right. It was at the crossroads we went wrong, but why not say no thoroughfare or downs only? I suppose the reasoning is that there is a road for about a mile before it dwindles into a track. Possibly, said Timothy doubtfully. He took out a rather grubby white and red spotted handkerchief and polished his sherry glass in a preoccupied way. I was glad that Amy was out of the room at the time. Before long she returned, and we talked about the Caxley Festival while the most delicious smells wreathed round us. The attitude of the two poets toward this event varied considerably, although both agreed somewhat vehemently that Caxley needed to be awakened. John Chandler looked upon it as a useful way of becoming known to a larger number of readers than before. Good publicity, he said briskly. Might even sell a dozen or so extra books, though one can't help feeling that at these affairs one is preaching to the converted. Still, it all helps. Timothy Ferdinand's attitude was less commercial. Oh, surely, he cried, it is the artist and his work that really matters. He needs an audience to stimulate him, and I think the festival will do that very well. Let's carry on this discussion while we eat, said Amy. We followed our hostess into the pretty dining room and confronted our sizzling ramekins. If you don't like crab, said Amy, there's melon ready on the sideboard. Only Betty asked if she might change. I adore crab, but I can't digest it, she said apologetically, and John rose swiftly to make the replacement. I thought how sensible Amy was to offer an alternative to one's first course. So often the hostess has gone to no end of trouble to produce something rather exotic, often with shellfish or avocado pear, which many people cannot take. I myself have several times been faced with tara masalata, which, with the best will in the world, I cannot get down. If only I had been offered a slice of melon or a nice little tot of orange or tomato juice waiting on the sideboard, how much happier I should have been. Horace Umbleditch sat beside me and John Chandler opposite. They were both exuberant talkers, and Amy and I had little to do in the way of keeping the conversation going. Timothy Ferdinand seemed slightly distraught at the foot of the table, facing Amy, but gulped down his crab as though he had not seen food for weeks, and nodded abstractedly at Betty's gentle remarks. Cold turkey and ham with a handsome salad followed the crab, and a dish of mammoth baked potatoes with butter melting in their floury tops. As Amy served us, I was amused to notice that Timothy was engrossed in cleaning between the prongs of his perfectly spotless fork by inserting them busily in the edge of Amy's beautiful damask tablecloth. He seemed quite unaware of anything amiss. His periodic nods at Betty's gallant monologue continued as before, as with eyes on his work he polished assiduously. Whether Amy saw him or not I could not say, but she continued serving with her usual charm, whilst commenting on the possibility of getting Jean Cole to attend the poetry reading during the festival week. Fortunately, the arrival of his main course saw the cessation of Timothy's cleaning operations, and he fell to with a will, and did not seem to feel the need to polish anything else during the sweet and cheese courses. At last he leant back and gave a sigh of contentment. What a perfect dinner! I hardly ever sit down to a meal when I'm alone, and certainly never to one as splendid as this. But don't you get hungry? Inquired Amy. I suppose I do, replied Timothy, looking about him vaguely. I eat an apple or a biscuit sometimes, anything that's lying about, you know. No wonder he looked so emaciated, I thought. Conversation then became concentrated upon the form of Amy's proposed evening, and later she took us all into the drawing-room to see the best way of arranging things for the great night. John Chandler appeared outstandingly practical about this, pointing out the best place for the piano with relation to the lighting, and the French windows, which with any luck might be opened to admit the warm evening air, scented with roses and stocks. He also suggested seating arrangements which would ensure the greatest number of people being at ease, and reminded me yet again of a military commander deploying his resources to best advantage. Timothy did not contribute much to the plans, but sipped his coffee thoughtfully, only surfacing once to remark that it was a blessing no microphone would be needed in a room this size, as he had a horror of things, and had been hurt by falling over one once, and hurt even more by the BBC mechanic's remarks about the incident. This led to a general discussion about whether it was a good thing to understand machinery, or whether it was better to disclaim all knowledge at the outset of how to deal with the objects and let someone else tackle the problem. Eventually, the delicate task of allotting time for each artist's performance was undertaken, and it was agreed that roughly half an hour, give or take 5 minutes, for each, would ensure a full evening's pleasure, and that it was up to each performer to rehearse his own contribution to fix the time it would take. By 11 o'clock the company had dispersed, looking happy and well fed. Amy turned down my offer to help with the washing up, evidently unheard by me and probably by everyone else in Amy's beautiful soundproof house. Her daily help had been hard at it, and the kitchen awaited the morrow as spotless as ever. "Do you think it went well?" asked Amy on the doorstep. Everything, but everything, I assured her as I let in the clutch, was absolutely perfect. I was delighted to have a letter from the office a day or two later to inform me that work on the new window to replace the present skylight would begin at the end of term and should be completed before the beginning of the summer term. This was good news indeed, although I should have preferred it to read "will be completed" rather than the cautious "should be completed." However, it was better perhaps to face the probability of a half-finished job than to be disappointed later. Mrs. Pringle shared Mr. Willett's doubts about Reg Thorne's ability to do the job at all, let alone to a deadline even as vague as this one. "When he'd done my poor sister-in-law in Caxley, you'd never believe," she assured. "You'd think he'd feel downright sorry for a widow woman as suffers something so cruel with arthritis in her hands that she hasn't done her back hair for years now. She told me herself as Reg promised faithful to have her straightened up by last Easter. He'd only got the porch put to rights. Bob Willett would have had it done in 2 days flat. But Reg hung it out just when the wind was in the east, fairly scouring out Peg's Hall with the front door off, and the bill, which came pretty smartish, I can tell you, was twice the estimate and give poor old Peg indigestion for a week." "Let's hope he's improved since then," I replied. Mr. Willett, who had joined us, snorted with disgust. "We'll be lucky to get that dratted dormer by next winter, and then I don't reckon it'll work. If there ain't trouble with the roof, I'll eat my hat." I refused to be depressed by my two Job's comforters. Nothing could be worse, I felt, than the present ancient skylight. I acknowledged the office's letter in enthusiastic terms and looked forward to seeing the workmen on the job before the Easter holiday. I felt less enthusiastic about Miss Briggs' progress in the infants' room. To be sure, she did not rush away at 3:30 as she had done previously, but I rarely saw her smile. She shouted at the babes, who, naturally, became noisier than ever, and she made no response to any of my overtures. Mr. Willett's early summing up of the young lady as "a fair old lump of a girl" was true. It was difficult to know how to improve matters. Over the years, I had worked with dozens of infants' teachers with just the screen between us. Some had been shy, some bold, some flighty, but all had been fairly cheerful, and some outstandingly gifted. A two-teacher school must be harmonious. There's no getting away from each other, which is possible in a large establishment, and I was at a loss to know how to overcome the girl's sulkiness. Was she ill, perhaps, I wondered? Was she in love? Was she homesick? Or had she realized that she was in a job she disliked and worried about how to get out of it? As far as I could find out, she had few friends in Caxley and had not joined any clubs or societies. She must be lonely, I felt, and her digs, though adequate, were not particularly comfortable, I gathered. I should have to have a word with her sometime, I supposed, gloomily. Only a week or two of the present term remained, and she was having a holiday in France at Easter. With any luck, she would return with more zest to Fairacre School. I did not need much persuading to put off this problem until her return, telling myself, not for the first time, that things might sort themselves out. My faith in the powers of destiny to resolve my problems is touching, but usually misplaced. The April weather, which had been kindly, now switched to the other extreme and became violently windy, with sudden vicious storms which scoured the countryside, dousing newborn lambs and tossing the daffodils to the ground. The skylight dripped steadily through these onslaughts, and the worst of the storms always seemed to coincide with playtime, so that the children were obliged to spend their break indoors, much to everyone's annoyance. Several new puddles appeared in the playground, and on the rare occasions when the children spent a few minutes outside, a new game had been devised, called, I gathered, Splash 'em. This involved jumping in the deepest part of a puddle just as someone passed, preferably an infant too small to retaliate and likely to get more of him drenched, and then to enjoy not only the victim's discomfiture, but also the hilarious glee of the onlookers. It was a game I did my best to stamp out properly, but not before several cross mothers had called to complain about sopping clothes and squelchy shoes. One of the stormiest days, the dinner lady slipped over in the playground. All the gravy was spilled, her knee was badly grazed, and her tights ruined. Miss Briggs took care of the school while I rendered first aid in the schoolhouse. She seemed more agitated about the loss of the gravy than her own injuries. "I could easily pour some of Beach Green's into a jug for you," she offered as I dabbed at her knee. "Don't worry, it won't hurt us to go short for once. The skirt is soaked. Would you like to borrow one?" The offer was accepted, and she went off dry, if not particularly elegant, and full of apologies. Mr. Annett, the headmaster at Beach Green, and also the choir master and organist at Fairacre, called on choir night to tell me that Miss Clare was staying with them. "She's not too bad," he began, shaking a wet umbrella energetically, "but Isabel found her with a heavy cold yesterday when she called, and persuaded her to have a day or two in our spare bed." "You're good Samaritans," I said. "Not a bit, but come and see her if you can." "I'll come tomorrow if it suits you." "Fine, we'll look forward to it." He sprinted churchwards, and I went indoors out of the beastly wind. This was no weather for poor frail Dolly Clare, I felt, but was comforted to think of her in such safe hands at Beach Green. If anything, the weather was wilder still when I drove the few miles from Fairacre to Beach Green. The windscreen wipers could scarcely keep pace with the torrent of rain which lashed the car. Young leaves and scraps of early blossom littered the leafy road as though it were an autumn evening. A fast-running rivulet ran each side of the lane, and every puddle sent a shower of drops, reminding me of Splash'em and my naughty boys. The few people I passed on the road were well wrapped up in waterproof garments ranging from southwesters to Wellingtons. I saw only one umbrella, and that was causing its owner considerable trouble. In rough weather, our downland winds can soon rip such a thing to pieces, and it is wiser to have one's hands free to tighten a headscarf or to turn up a raincoat collar against the onslaught. I found Miss Clare sitting by a cheerful fire. She was dressed and had a pretty lace shawl round her shoulders. "Isabel had to go out," she told me. "She's giving a talk over at Springbourne, and I wouldn't let her put it off. Really, I'm quite rested now after 2 nights and 1 whole day in bed." She certainly looked very well, though as thin as ever, but her eyes were bright, and I think she was enjoying the company of the Annetts. "They are so kind," she went on, "and the more I know of them, the more I am reminded of my early teaching days when Mr. and Mrs. Hope looked after me so well." "Was that the headmaster who had to leave Fairacre?" Miss Clare nodded sadly. "He was a gentle soul and very musical, like the Annetts, but they lost their only child when she was 12 or so, and he never got over it. He took to the bottle, you know, and left soon after the Great War in 1919, if I remember correctly." "You remember the war well enough," I said. "Too well," she said, "not only because I lost my dear Arnold in France, but because of the appalling number of young men from here who never came back. One of the saddest sights in Fairacre School was the black armbands worn by so many of the children. And the tears. You would see some little mite busy writing, and then the pen would stop, and the head would go down, and the crying begin. It was dreadful to feel so helpless in the face of such sorrow. Mr. Hope felt it all terribly. Sometimes I wonder if that was another reason for his taking to drink." "He didn't drink in school?" "No, thank goodness. He made up for it at home, and was simply morose and befuddled in school toward the end. He was still working hard, though, and did a great deal to help the war effort, and saw that the children helped too. Why, I remember that even the youngest babies were set to fraying pieces of white cotton and linen with a darning needle to make field dressings. And of course we all put as much as we could spare, which wasn't much in those days, into war savings stamps." "But at least you were spared bombings and rushing into air raid shelters in that war." "We saw practically nothing of the war in Fairacre," agreed Miss Clare, "and I think, despite the horror stories in the newspapers, that there was less real hatred toward the Germans. We prayed every morning for the war to end, and I dare say we realized that German children were doing the same. We disliked them, of course, and intensely, and I remember Mr. Hope taking a grammar lesson at the other end of the classroom. He was trying to get the children to stop using the word got With small success, as you might imagine, he wrote it on the blackboard and crossed it through. Got, he cried. A horrible word. It must be German. Simply leave it out and say, I have a pen. I have a new nib. Understand? And one of the Bryant boys, a real little gypsy, said, I ain't got neither, sir. And everyone broke into laughter, including Mr. Hope. He sounds a good chap, I said. A pity he had to leave. A tragedy, agreed Dolly. He was as much a casualty of the war as my dear Arnold. She fingered the gold locket which hung under the lacy shawl. She wore it constantly, and I knew that it contained a photograph of the red-haired young man who had shared the fate of thousands of others whose names were written upon country memorials and in the hearts of those who loved them. And we will hear more from Fairacre next time.